Have you had any trouble recently getting an appointment to see a GP? A few days ago, I was discussing with someone that Martin Sewell is a part-time GP and also the minister of Trinity Church in Lancaster in the other half of his week. And Luke Parkinson is another local GP who, in the other half of his week, he's the minister at the church that meets in Capernwray Chapel. And we concluded, the person I was talking to, we concluded that, if you're having trouble getting an appointment to see your doctor, it's probably because he's running a church for the other half of his week, and that's why there are a limited number of appointments. One of the reasons why it's important for people to be able to see their GP face-to-face is that doctors are meant to, they're charged with providing what's called comprehensive care. So, if you go to your doctor with, a sore finger or something, they're trained to not just look at your finger, but to look at you, to see if there are any signs of deeper problems. Is there some sign that there's something wrong with your heart or some internal organ? Is there some indication there's a problem with your state of mind? Did you perhaps make an appointment about your finger because you really hoped the doctor would ask how you are and there would be a chance to say that you're down, you're worried? So those who are considering a career as a GP are told this: looking after the whole person, the physical, emotional, social, spiritual, cultural, and economic aspects is a vital part of any GP's role. That's a pretty wide-ranging kind of role, isn't it, to have? Jesus said that he had come to be a doctor to the world. People who were ill flocked to him, or they were brought to him by others, and he helped them. But how far did this great doctor Jesus, how far did he manage to provide what the NHS calls comprehensive care? How good was Jesus at dealing with the whole person and not just the particular ailment that was obvious? Well, if you've got the Bible open, the NIV divides this into 3 sections, and in each of them, Jesus heals somebody. Jesus, of course, claimed to be God's Son, to have God's power to act in the world. The Gospel writers claim that Jesus is the creator of the universe. He's the one who built you in your mother's womb. He knows how every part of you fits together. He knows how you're meant to work. And Jesus proves that that's who he is. He proves that by healing people just with a word or a touch. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, so the last verse of chapter 7, people were amazed at Jesus' authority because of the way he taught. Well, now we're going to see his authority, not just to teach, but his authority over sickness. So, in the first section, from verses 1 to 4, there's a man with leprosy. If you look at the little footnote, the word that's translated leprosy is really a word that means a variety of skin diseases, not necessarily the disease that we now identify as leprosy. But this man has a skin disease and he is cured. In the next section, from verse 5, the servant of a centurion is paralyzed and in terrible suffering. But by verse 13, he is healed. In verse 14, in the third section, Peter's mother-in-law is lying in bed with a fever. And Jesus deals with the fever so fully that she gets up and she begins to wait on Jesus. And later that day, verse 16, Jesus drives out demons from many people and he healed all the sick who were brought to him. So Jesus is healing people all over the place, but all these people had much deeper needs. And Jesus dealt wonderfully with the presenting problems, but he went much, much deeper than that, as only he could. I suggest to you he went even deeper than a GP would do, even if they go beyond their 10-minute appointment time. They're never going to get to deal with people in the depth that Jesus did here. He went to the heart of the matter, right down to the ailments and the disorders in people's lives that were a much deeper problem than just what was on the surface. So if we ask how comprehensive is the work of the greatest doctor ever, well, the answer from this passage is that Jesus, the doctor, he fully restores people. He fully restores people. So let's look back over those 3 sections and see how that is what is going on, that he's doing more than just dealing with the problem that is obvious. First of all, there we are. From untouchable to clean. From untouchable to clean. So have a look at the first verse, Matthew 8, verse 1. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." So Jesus heals the man of his leprosy or whatever the skin disease was. But do you notice he doesn't ask Jesus to heal him? He says something a bit different. He says, can Jesus make him clean? And in verse 3, Jesus doesn't say be cured, he says be clean. And then it says immediately he was cured, although if you look at the little footnote, you'll see actually, literally it doesn't say cured, literally it says he was cleansed, he was made clean. Why is everyone talking that way about leprosy? Well, the Old Testament had taught God's people to think that way. So clean means ceremonially clean, not just, washed with water. It's related to the idea of being holy, not the same thing, but it's a similar idea. So God taught his people in the Old Testament to distinguish between clean and unclean. There were clean animals and unclean animals. There were clean places and unclean places. There were clean people and unclean people. And leprosy was one of those things that, according to the Old Testament law, it made people unclean. And others were told to keep away from them. Now, in terms of our modern knowledge about infection, of course, that makes sense. But in the Bible, that's not talked about. It's much more to do with the character of God. So God is a holy and perfect God, and sin and imperfection and disorder and disease are not compatible with a holy and a perfect God. They need to be kept out, as it were. So this leper, he would have been excluded from mixing with other people. He would have lived outside the city. At this stage, they've just come down the mountain, but they haven't entered a city yet. He wouldn't have been allowed in the city. He would have been kept away from other people. He probably couldn't have worked. He couldn't even have gone to the temple to worship God. He was excluded from God's presence, and nobody would ever touch him, because to touch a ceremonially unclean person would make you unclean. So you see, his problem is much deeper than just, the discomfort of a skin condition. He's untouchable. He's an outcast. And yet, somehow he knows that Jesus can make him clean, and that's what he asks for. And do you see what Jesus does? Verse 3, he reached out his hand and he did what nobody else would ever have done. He touched the man. Imagine how that touch changed him, how it would have lifted him, lifted his spirits. And notice that Jesus doesn't become unclean when he touches the unclean man. The opposite happens. The clean makes the unclean clean. The man is cleansed by Jesus' touch. And then what does Jesus do? Verse 4, he sends him off to the priest. Because what this man needs even more than his health restored is to be readmitted to the fellowship of God's people and to the worship of the Lord. And only a priest could certify that, yes, the disease has gone and this man is clean. Not just healed, clean. So we see Jesus is able to deal with uncleanness in all its forms, not just leprosy. The gospel is good news. Despised outcasts are brought in by Jesus. They're welcomed by him. Their sin is forgiven, but they're cleansed from everything that would keep them out of God's presence and the company of other people, God's people. That's what Jesus does. I don't know if you've ever sat down in someone's house and then realized to your horror that you've just tracked mud across the hall from your shoes and into the living room. You know, you feel embarrassed. It's a bit of a disaster, isn't it? What are you going to do now? What are you going to say? How are you going to sort it out? Perhaps you wish you'd not been invited and you'd not come in. And the more that our eyes are open to the true glory of God, the more we realize we're out of place. We don't belong with such perfection and goodness. And so we must come to Jesus and say, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And he can. From untouchable to clean. Secondly, from despised outsider to honored guest. Verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home, paralyzed and in terrible suffering. Jesus said to him, I will go and heal him. Once again, a man is healed, but Jesus again is dealing with a much bigger problem than just that. The man who's come to Jesus is a centurion, a Gentile, a Roman commander of 80 or 100 soldiers. Amazingly, this man comes to Jesus, a Jew, so part of the subject people in this occupied nation, a poor man, that's what Jesus would have looked like, isn't it? And he comes and asks for Jesus' help. And when Jesus says that, yes, he'll come, the centurion replies, verse 8, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. Why does he say he doesn't deserve to have Jesus come under his roof? I mean, he's an important officer in the Roman army. How can this man not be worthy to have a poor traveling preacher come to his house? I mean, he will know that no Jew would go into the house of a Gentile because that would make them defiled, unclean. But it seems he's also realized that Jesus somehow is worthy of much greater honor than he himself is, despite his position and his status. And he certainly seems to be certain that Jesus has amazing authority to command whatever he wants. Jesus is really surprised at what the answer this man gives. Just say the word and my servant will be healed. The centurion is under authority, so he knows when he gets a command from someone who's above him, he does it. And he gives orders to his soldiers and he's obeyed. That's the way it works in his military world. And in the same way, he's thought about that and he's realized that Jesus has that kind of authority to command what he wants and it will be done. You know, if Jesus commands his servant to be well again, it's going to happen. So here's a despised outsider, a Gentile, you know, as far as the Jews are concerned, a despised outsider, showing that somehow he trusts Israel's king and savior. And the surprise is, why don't the people of Israel get this? Because Jesus says, verse 10, I tell you the truth, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. Throughout the Gospels, people are constantly astonished at Jesus, but this actually is the one place in Matthew's Gospel where it says that Jesus is astonished, and he's astonished at the faith of this man. That's what it says in verse 10. And then, verse 11 and 12, Jesus makes a startling declaration. He says, look, many of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those people who are the inheritors of the explicit invitation to come to the Messiah's banquet, many of them are not going to be there because they don't have faith in Jesus, in God's Son. While at the same time, he says, Many of the Gentiles, those who are outsiders to all this, they're going to come from all over the world. Verse 11, from east and from west, and will take their place at the feast. They're the ones who are going to put their faith and trust in Jesus and will be there at the feast in the kingdom of heaven. So what's Jesus saying? Is he saying God has changed the invitation list? Like imagine 2 weeks before someone's wedding, they decided, well, we're not actually going to have any of those guests. I'm going to cancel them all. We'll get a different bunch in. It's not that. God hasn't gone back on his promises. Entry into his kingdom was only ever possible by trusting in his word. And now God's Son, Jesus, has arrived, and he's speaking his Father's word. And those who won't receive Jesus are rejecting the Father who sent him. And sadly, as Jesus says, verse 12, they deserve to be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is terrible news for Israel as a whole. Many will be lost. Many will be lost before the day comes when that whole nation is brought to see that Jesus is their true Savior. That what matters here is faith in Jesus and not your ancestry. Well, it's bad news if you're rejecting Jesus, but this is wonderful news for all those people out there in the world, the people who were always outside of the people of God. People like the centurion who has this faith in Jesus. People like his servant who's healed by Jesus with just a command. They are the sign that Jesus can, by a simple word, heal the sick, whoever they are, raise the dead, change a despised outsider, wherever they come from in the world, into an honored guest in his glorious kingdom. That's the deep problem that Jesus is dealing here, bringing someone who's a despised outsider to be an honored guest and promising that that will be true for many, many others. And then finally, from burdened to liberated. Verse 14. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her, and she got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. So Peter's feverish mother-in-law lies sick in her bed until Jesus arrives, and then he touches her hand, and she rises again. Restored, healed, and ready to serve Jesus. And in the evening, many who are burdened with sickness or burdened with demons, they come to Jesus wanting him to lift their burdens, to free them from their illness, or to free them from the evil spirits that oppress them. And that's what Jesus does. He frees each of them. And Matthew sums it up in verse 17. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. Again, there's a little footnote, really helpful, telling us that that comes from Isaiah 53. Chapter 53 of Isaiah is probably the best known chapter in the whole of that book, written, of course, hundreds of years before Jesus, and it talks about God's servant who will suffer. He will be pierced for our transgressions. He will be crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. How is it that Jesus can free people from their burdens? How can he free us from our burdens? Because he's taken the full weight of them on himself. That's what that prophecy in Isaiah is telling us. He took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. And so here's what we need to do. We need to come to Dr. Jesus, and we need to give him our burdens. When will Jesus, the great doctor, lift our burdens? When will he do that? Well, if we're trusting him, then he's already paid in full the price for our sinful rebellion. He did that supremely on the cross. So, if we're trusting him, we have that assurance of forgiveness in Jesus now. He's lifted that burden of guilt. But the healing work of Jesus in our lives, the comprehensive work, the holistic work, him dealing with every burden of ours, that's only just begun. Dr. Jesus, I suspect, still has much work to do on you and on me. The thing is, he won't fail to complete all that he has promised. So we can come to him now. We can give to him now all that is weighing us down. We can trust him to lift those infirmities. And he will do that when he judges the time is right for us. All that we are burdened with, the frailty of our bodies, the weakness of our resolve, the disappointment that we feel at our own foolishness, our limited capacity for enjoying God's goodness, all of these things, along with all our other weaknesses and struggles, whatever they are, it's all going to be finally lifted from us as Jesus returns and we join him in the fullness of his glorious kingdom. So right now we put our burdens on Jesus and we trust he will deal with the things now that he needs to deal with and he knows that need to be dealt with. And then in the future, we look forward to him dealing with everything in its fullness when he returns. For he took up our infirmities and he carried our diseases. How comprehensive is the work of the greatest doctor ever? Well, Jesus the doctor fully restores people. And if we're trusting in him, he's not going to fail to do that in our lives in his time. So come to Dr. Jesus. Come and give him your burdens. Shall we pray together?